Hello friends! In today's video I will be showing you my attempt to make a 1910s cape from a free American Duchess pattern. American Duchess is an awesome company that makes pretty shoes that I really want to buy. You'll see some really nice videos potentially of people making these and they turn out lovely. And this is the best attempt of someone who doesn't really know what they're doing. So, lower expectations. Well, it's something. My fabric came in. Look, it's fabric that exists that I got from curbside pickup because we are all quarantined. Mine is going to be red and gold Gryffindor theme because I am a nerd. If you go to American Duchess's website, you can pull up this wrap cape pattern. I'm going to be tracing this out onto some large paper that I got from Kroger. It's not that large, so I'm gonna need to tape it together. You can see up here in the corner, 1 square equals 1 inch. So you basically just count the number of squares and then measure out that amount of inches. When there is a curve, what I've been doing is counting the number of squares, aka the number of inches to get to a point or near to a point to help find some places along here that will help sketch out the curve more neatly. I don't have a French curve, all I have is years of art experience in making curves look pretty. But I'm pretty happy with how these pattern pieces are looking overall. I've got 3 more on this page and 1 big one down here to cut out. And then it'll be time to start actually working with the fabric. I can start to see how it's going to fit together. The marks there. I've also noted, it says how many you need to cut out of each, and I've noted that on my pattern pieces to hopefully help me make sure I cut out the right amount. This is the back piece, and this is only actually half the back piece. You basically flip this over to make the full back piece and then reflect this. So it's going to basically be this mirror image over here to make the second half of the cape, I believe. Fun fact, this gold fabric I'm using for the lining is an old tablecloth that I bought at a thrift shop and used to cover a closet, but since I'm not gonna have company for a long time, it has been sacrificed to the cause. As I am starting to trace these and cut them out, I'm pinning them to the fabric to help them stay in place. Tracing with chalk, because that's gonna come out a lot easier than any ink. And I'm also being careful of the grain of the fabric. I originally wanted to align this here, but I noticed that this was up and down on the fabric pattern, and that probably indicates that the grain of the fabric should be going up and down like this. Not 100%, but better safe than sorry, because the fabric is less likely to stretch this way and this way than it is to stretch sideways. A lot more stretch when it's going diagonally from how the weave is. As I was tracing these out, I was conscious of the fact that my gold fabric, unlike my red fabric, had 2 different sides. So while I was laying these out, I chose one side that I wanted to be the outside of the fabric and tried to be very conscious with the way I was laying out my pattern pieces so that all of my fabric lining would end up with the same side of the fabric facing out. This pattern does not include seam allowance, so I'm going to be cutting about a 1/2 inch away from where I've traced. Next, I wanted to lay out all my pieces to see how they lined up and see how they all fit together, which was pretty cool to see. You can see here the 3 triangles I drew on each side to make the darts. I cut those triangles out of the pattern paper, laid that paper on the fabric to trace the lines. To make the darts, I basically just pinched those two chalk lines together, pinned along that line, sewed it on the wrong side of the fabric, and then cut off the excess. I, for some reason, do not have any footage of this, but you can see at least where I traced it out. Next, I started lining my fabric pieces up and putting some pins in them. I sewed the top of the shoulders together first and then went to put the cape into the arm's eye, first having to kick my sweet Minnie off of my sewing table. No matter how cute she is, she couldn't stay there. In attaching the cape, I started by machine sewing the long straight lines together, remembering to double back over the start of my seam to help reinforce it. Just starting where the arm capey bit turns, you can see where I've marked where it goes together and sort of the ends. Then I'm going to sew one big running stitch all around here to help gather this a bit and make it fit into the other bit a bit better. I've got my running stitch done through the whole top part of the arm, and you can see when I pull on it, it wrinkles stuff up to help compact that area of the clothes. I'm going to try and line it up roughly with the area in which I'm trying to fill. And now to help keep that stable, I'm gonna take this point where they meet and sew that. And then before I machine stitch this down, I'm just gonna do a little bit of a back stitch to help start to secure this. I found this step with gathering the top of the cape before fitting into the arm's eye very useful. I'm not certain if it's needed or even what I was supposed to do. I learned that trick from a Foundations Revealed workshop for fitting sleeves, so even if it isn't necessary or proper, it is something that ended up helping me. Alright, I have now finished sewing the capey bits onto the shoulder. That's a technical term, capey bit. I'm gonna be honest, there were a couple of times, especially with the darts, and then on one of these seams where I had to unpick it and redo it. It's definitely not a completely smooth process, but it's going. The next step is to turn and baste down the 3 straight edges of the collar contrast. And I've just pinned that down. I'm gonna use a whip stitch or felling stitch with gold thread to hopefully neatly put this down. I didn't like how that looked, so I'm going to try something else. I'm going to try turning it over like this and then more sewing it to itself so that way you can't see it coming through. And then once I iron it, hopefully it will hold its shape. So I'm gonna give that a try. And for those of you wondering, no, I do not own an ironing board. That is why I'm ironing it on the floor. The only reason I even have an iron is because a friend of mine moved to Chile and was trying to get rid of a 3-story house full of stuff. It is not perfect, but with it folded over twice, you can't see the stitches, and I'm reasonably happy with how this looks. The next step is to top stitch down onto this. You could almost certainly use a machine to stitch that down, but I think I'm gonna stitch this by hand because it's kind of nice and meditative, and I'm in quarantine. I don't have anywhere to wear this cape in a long time. So, top stitching by hand to come. The the next step is to put the right sides together. So I'm gonna take the two color pieces, trapping the fancy one in there, and I'm going to pin them down, sew along the edges by machine, and then turn it inside out. Or rather, right now it is inside out, and then I'm gonna turn it right side out. So I'm gonna try a thing, and this might ruin the whole project, who knows, it might turn out good. I've cut out these pieces of paper and pinned them down and traced them with pen. I'm going to try creating sort of cutouts, so I'm gonna cut inward from this and fold it back to create a seam, so that way the gorgeous gold fabric that I really like can show through more. This symbol is called an Awen, I believe. It's an ancient symbol of like inspiration and truth and all that jazz, and I really like it. Next, I folded back the lines I had cut for the Awen. I checked the pronunciation, it's Awen. And I just did a neat little top stitch right next to those to hold all of those lines back. Oh, several hours later. I have finally finished sewing the outside of this together. This is how the back turned out. That is a cat who likes walking over things. The outside of the fabric is facing me. So right now the two pieces of fabric are facing how they will when it's finished. But before I sew them together, they need to go inside out. Only trick is, this fella needs to sit in here and it needs to be the right way when I'm turning things inside out. To clarify, this pattern called for the lining and the outside to be sewn right sides together. So basically you sew it inside out and then flip it right side out and you can't see the outside seams. But figuring out how the collar was supposed to go was kind of giving me a headache. To get a better idea of how the collar would go in the end, I assembled the cape as it would look when it was its final product, but with the seams tucked in and pinned together. Then from there, I flipped it inside out with the collar stuck where it needed to be. It was awkward and roundabout, but it got me where I needed to go. Pins, lots of pins. I don't have enough to do the whole garment, so I'm probably just going to do the top wrap bits. You can see the collar is sandwiched in there. Hopefully in the right direction after I did that little thought experiment before beginning. Time to throw this on the machine. And now I've pinned the rest of the lining inside out to the outside, and this side lined up really nice, and this side did not. But I'm gonna do my best, and hopefully it was just the red fabric stretching a bit, maybe. You can tell that my cat Minnie is very fascinated by my sewing, but something that Minnie should be careful to observe, much like anyone wishing to replicate this cape pattern, is that when you are sewing the very bottom, you need to leave a gap of a few inches. You can't close it up completely, because then you're left without a way to reach inside and turn it right side out. I was careful to trim off the excess, leaving it as close cropped as I could at the corners to make it easier to turn it right side out. Oh no, I will need to fix that patch. And all the collar got caught, so I'm gonna need to go back and do that. Not perfect first time, folks. Not, perfect. Stupid stabby pen. But there definitely needs me to go back and fix some spots. It is actually looking like a thing that will fit, and that's pretty cool.
Some sewing later.
I fixed all the problem spots, turned it inside out, and I am actually really happy with it. I'm going to be ironing things to make sure they lie nice and flat, and I'm probably going to do a bit of hand sewing to keep this back part lined up, and then I just need to put the hook and eye on these so they can fasten around my back.
I ended up felling along all the lines on the back that I had cut, and that really helped it lie nice and flat and clean. I also remembered to hand stitch at the bottom, that gap that I had left for turning things inside out. Spending a lot of quality time with my wonderful cat, as always. And then finally, I also did some hand stitching around the edges to help them lie flat. They were kind of bulky and ironing didn't help, so I did a back stitch along the edges, and I also did some stitching along the inside to help hold the lining and the outside fabric together. The only part where I didn't end up adding extra hand stitching was the very bottom of the cape. I went in with a fancier pattern that my sewing machine can do. I tested it on a piece of scrap fabric first and then went along the very bottom of the cape. It didn't turn out as nicely as I wanted, but it holds the fabric and the seam nice and close together. I got my hook and eyes, also from curbside pickup, and then very messily sewed them onto the cape. Of course, the day after I finished, I saw a free article on Foundations Revealed about how to neatly sew these on with a buttonhole stitch, which I might do at a later point.
And now, thank you, John. I am lint rolling the cape because there are so many little tiny pieces of fabric on the floor of that art room that just, well, tiny fabric and mostly threads that I just cut and leave there that now stuck to my lovely cape. And with that, the cape is done. And now it's time for the part of the video where I frolic around a forest 6 feet away from people, and there's pretty music and stuff. Okay, so reflections overall. I am very happy with how this cape turned out, especially considering that it's the first pattern I've tried to follow in literally years. I think some of the hand finishing that I did, going back and making the seams lay nice and flat, really helped the look overall, and was also some of the most enjoyable work that I did. I really enjoyed the hand sewing bits. I'm glad I did the random bit on the back that was a complete whim, even though that was mostly hand stitching. Again, I ended up really enjoying that, and I like how it looks. Overall, it does still feel kind of costumey, probably because I chose Gryffindor colors, so I could eventually maybe use it in a costume. Also because I used a tablecloth and the cheapest flannel fabric I could find at Joann's, because I didn't want to spend a bunch of money on something and then end up screwing it up and wasting the money I put into that fabric. It also probably looks costumey because it's not perfect. It's a first attempt. It's not going to look beautifully tailored unless I get a lot of help, which for this, I was mostly relying on YouTube knowledge. I tried to darken the fabric with instant coffee and that didn't work, but I think having a darker fabric would also have made it look less costumey, but you know what? We're in a quarantine, so I take what Joann has in stock, especially because I'm a cheapskate and wanted the one that's like $3 a yard. But overall, this cape cost me like $10 in materials, and for how it turned out, I'm really happy. I will probably be wearing this in my daily life. Out on the riverfront, it was actually really comfy. With the wind, it kept me just warm enough, and also I kind of have the reputation of wearing whatever the hell I want, and I feel fabulous in this billowy, flowy cape.